Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're taking a journey, not really to the grand courts or the battlefields of the Mughal Empire, but down to the ground level, the bedrock of its existence, really.
hmm
We're focusing on the 16th and 17th centuries in India, and specifically the lives of, well, the vast majority of people, not the emperors or the nobles, but the folks living in villages working the land.
That's right. And agriculture, I mean, it was utterly fundamental during this period. It wasn't just, an economic activity. It was the basis of life itself
hmm
for individuals, for families, for whole communities,
Right.
and for the Mughal state, that huge empire, the wealth coming off the land.
Yeah.
That was its main source of power, its engine.
And our understanding of this really vital, complex rural world, it doesn't just come from guesswork, does it? It's about piecing things together from the historical sources we actually have.
Exactly. It's a mosaic.
And our main guide for today, I suppose, is the remarkable Ain-i Akbari, Abul Fazl's incredibly detailed record from Emperor Akbar's court.
Yes, the Ain is absolutely indispensable. It gives us this unique, systematic overview. But, and this is crucial, we always have to remember, it's very much a view from the top.
Ah, right.
It was designed, to present the empire in a specific way, harmonious, ordered. So to get a more complete picture, we absolutely need to supplement it
That's what kind of other sources?
with things like regional revenue records, from places like Gujarat, Maharashtra, Rajasthan, and even the extensive documents that the early East India Company started generating, especially as they began operating in eastern India.
Right, because those wouldn't have the same imperial agenda, perhaps.
Precisely. They add these crucial layers. They offer glimpses into conflicts, sometimes peasant perspectives, the ground level realities that might look, well, a little different from that official harmonious vision.
Okay. So our mission then in this deep dive is to use all these sources, the Ain and the others, to sort of unpack the intricate relationships that define this agrarian society.
Exactly. We want to explore the connections between the peasants, the ones actually, working the soil,
The landed elite, the Zamindars, we'll talk a lot about them.
and the powerful Mughal state itself, trying to govern and, crucially, tax them all. It's about understanding daily life, how the economy functioned at its most basic level, the social structures.
That shaped their whole world.
And grasping this period through the lens of the agrarian world, it's really key to understanding how such a vast empire was built and, importantly, sustained.
Yeah.
It offers these really potent insights into historical systems, production, power dynamics, community organization, systems whose echoes, surprisingly, can still resonate today. It's a deep dive into the foundations.
Okay, let's get into it then. Let's start by setting the scene, the rural landscape itself, and how we actually see it through these sources.
Right. So the first thing to really grasp is the sheer scale of the rural population. As we said, the vast majority of people in India during this time, 16th, 17th centuries, estimates often put it around 85%.
85%, that's staggering.
It is. So for these millions and millions of people, life was just inextricably linked to the cycles of nature, the demands of agriculture. Their whole lives, their days, weeks, years, were defined by these seasonal tasks.
Like what specifically?
Well, the intense labor of tilling the soil, the hope you invest when you're sowing the seeds, the collective effort of weeding, endless weeding, and finally, the crucial time of harvest.
The rhythm of the agricultural year just dictated everything.
It really did. And it wasn't just about growing food grains, wheat or rice, important as they were. Peasants were also key producers of these agro-based goods, things processed right there in the village or sold on.
Like sugar, oil.
Exactly. Sugar from sugarcane, oil from oil seeds. These were vital parts of the economy, linking that village out into wider markets.
Now, it's easy, I think, to picture Mughal India as just this one endless, uniform, fertile plain. But the sources are clear, the landscape was incredibly diverse, wasn't it?
Oh, absolutely. That's a crucial point to keep in mind. Beyond the really fertile cultivated areas, there were huge tracts of much drier land, significant hilly regions, and importantly, massive areas covered by forests.
Right. Not just marginal spaces.
Not at all. They constituted a substantial part of the subcontinent's geography. And this variety in topography meant that, well, agricultural practices, the types of communities living there, how the state interacted with them, it could vary hugely from region to region. We can't just paint it all with one brush.
This varied landscape makes our job as historians trying to understand it particularly challenging, especially when we think about the people right at the bottom of the system.
It does. And here's the key challenge, something the sources themselves reveal. The peasants, the millions, actually doing the tilling, the harvesting, they generally didn't leave behind written records of their own. Their lives, their thoughts, their struggles, their expectations. Unlike court officials or merchants or travelers, their voices aren't directly accessible in the archives in the same way.
So we have to rely on records created by others, viewed from, well, different perspectives.
Exactly. And this brings us right back to those crucial sources. The chronicles, the administrative documents from the Mughal court, they form the primary layer.
And the most famous, the most detailed of those, the Ain-i Akbari again, compiled by Akbar's, well, brilliant and incredibly industrious courtier, Abu Fazl.
Right. And it wasn't just a history book. It was an administrative manual, a detailed statistical survey. It meticulously recorded the state's arrangements for cultivation, its methods for assessing and collecting revenue, and its view on managing those powerful landed magnates, the Zamindars.
So the Ain tells us what the state wanted to know and how the state wanted things to work.
Precisely. Abu Fazl's central aim, with the Ain you can say, was to paint this picture of Akbar's empire as ordered, prosperous, harmonious, with a strong, benevolent ruling class ensuring stability.
And from that viewpoint, any trouble in the countryside
Was seen as something almost inevitably doomed to fail against the might and the right of the state. It's a priceless resource for understanding that imperial perspective, the administrative machine, but like we said, fundamentally a view from the top.
And that's where those other sources provide that vital counterpoint, that necessary balance.
Absolutely essential. Those regional revenue records, Gujarat, Maharashtra, Rajasthan, mostly 17th, 18th century, they weren't compiled with that same grand imperial harmonizing vision. They were practical documents dealing with the messy realities of revenue collection.
Right.
And the extensive records left by the early English East India Company, especially for Eastern India, they offer insights from outsiders with their own set of concerns, primarily trade and revenue acquisition.
And what do these other sources add that the Ain might sort of smooth over?
Well, they often document conflicts much more directly. Disputes between peasants and zamindars or between peasants and state officials. They give us these fragmented but invaluable glimpses into the peasants' own perceptions, what they saw as fair treatment, their expectations about revenue demands, how they reacted when those expectations weren't met.
So they show the cracks in the facade sometimes.
Exactly. They let us see the moments where that harmonious vision presented in the Ain just wasn't the lived reality for many people on the ground. They add texture, complexity, nuance.
Okay. So with that understanding of the landscape and our sources, let's zoom in on the people themselves, the peasants, the cultivators. What do the sources tell us about them? Who were they?
Well, the Indo-Persian sources, the texts from the time, they use several terms almost interchangeably for peasants. You see rayat, the plural, is raya, Muzarian, Kisan, Asani, these all pop up.
Okay.
But by the 17th century, these sources make a practical distinction. They differentiate between two main types of cultivators based on where they lived relative to the land they farmed.
Interesting. What was that distinction?
So first, you had the Kashta. These were the residents of the village where they actually owned and cultivated their land. They were the sort of settled, established core of the village agricultural population.
Got it. And the second type?
Those were the Kashta. Now, unlike the Kashta, they were non-resident cultivators. They might live in one village but farm land in another, often working that land under some kind of contract.
Why would someone do that? Leave their home village to farm somewhere else? Seems like a hassle.
Well, the sources suggest a couple of key reasons. Sometimes, it seems, it was a deliberate choice. Maybe the revenue terms being offered in a nearby village were just more favorable, an economic opportunity to improve their situation.
Makes sense.
But often, it was probably born out of compulsion. Economic distress, maybe the aftermath of a famine, could make it impossible to keep cultivating in their home village. It might force them to seek land and opportunity elsewhere just to survive.
That's a fascinating insight right there. It shows that even at this fundamental level, there was peasant mobility, driven by economics, opportunity, hardship. They weren't just stuck immovably to one plot of land.
Exactly. That mobility is a crucial feature of the whole system. Now, thinking about the size of their holdings, were these average peasants farming large areas?
Not at all, based on what the sources tell us. They suggest the typical peasant holding in North India was, well, pretty modest. It seldom exceeded what a single family could realistically cultivate, using just one pair of bullocks and maybe 2 plows. And many, in fact, had even less land, fewer resources than that.
So what would count as relatively well-off, a sort of affluent peasant?
The sources give us some specific examples, which help give a sense of scale. In Gujarat, owning around 6 acres might put you in the affluent category. In Bengal, the upper limit for an average peasant farm was closer to 5 acres, and you'd probably need about 10 acres to be considered a rich Assami. 10 acres. They're not huge estates by any means, but still, 10 acres marks a significant difference in potential income status within the village context.
Definitely.
And this land, even these small plots, was it individually owned?
Yes, and this is really important. Despite that strong sense of village community we'll talk about, the principle of individual land ownership was well established. Peasant lands were treated like property. They could be bought, sold, even mortgaged.
Right.
There's a vivid 19th century description, actually, of the Delhi Agra region that historians think applies just as well to the 17th century. It talks about how peasants would mark the limits of each field with borders of raised earth, brick, and thorn so that thousands of such fields may be counted.
That really paints a picture, doesn't it? All those small, individually marked plots. It emphasizes the fragmentation, the individual demarcation, even within what looks like a homogeneous village landscape from afar.
Exactly. Now, you mentioned agricultural expansion earlier. What were the forces driving that increase in cultivation during this period? The sources seem to point to 3 main factors converging. First, the sheer abundance of cultivable land that was still available. Second, a relatively large supply of labor which connects to population growth. And third, as we just discussed, the mobility of the peasantry.
So where there was land and opportunity, people could and did move to cultivate it.
Precisely. And Babur, the very first Mughal emperor, he was particularly struck by this mobility. It's one of those great surprising details you find in the sources.
He was. What did he say?
He was almost bewildered by it. In his memoirs, the Baburnama, he observes how in Hindustan, hamlets and villages, towns indeed, are depopulated and set up in a moment. He talks about his surprise that people from a town inhabited for years could just flee in a day and a half, leaving almost no trace.
Wow.
And conversely, they could quickly set up a new settlement somewhere else.
And he connected this to their farming and resources.
Exactly. He noted that because many crops were rain-grown, permanent houses or walls weren't immediately essential. There were abundant natural resources, like cosgrass for thatch, wood for simple structures. It allowed for quick settlement. And he commented on the population, calling it unlimited, which maybe was an exaggeration, but it meant there was always potential labor to quickly bring new areas under the plow if land became available. This flexibility, this availability of both land and people was fundamental to expansion.
So rain was the main source of water, the monsoon. But Babur also describes artificial irrigation methods, suggesting they were pretty crucial for certain crops or regions.
Yes, the monsoons were the absolute lifeline, no question. But for crops needing consistent water, or for cultivation outside the main rainy season, artificial irrigation was vital. And Babur, again, gives us these detailed accounts of the devices he saw being used in different parts of the empire.
What kind of devices?
Well, in places like Lahore and Dipalpur, he describes a system powered by bullocks. The bullocks turn gears, which turn a large wheel. This wheel has 2 circles of rope draped over it, with wooden strips and pitchers attached. As the wheel turns, the pitchers dip into the well, lift the water up, and empty it into a trough at the top, and from there it flows into channels.
That sounds quite mechanically sophisticated for, rural areas back then.
It really does. And alongside that, he describes a simpler, much more labor-intensive system he saw around Agra, Chandwar, Bayana. This was basically a large bucket system.
How did that work?
It involved a wooden fork and a roller at the well edge. A rope tied to a large bucket goes over the roller, and the other end is tied to a bullock. To draw water, you walk the bullock away from the well, pulling the bucket up. But it needed one person just to drive the bullock and another person at the wellhead to manually empty that heavy bucket into the irrigation channels.
A lot more human effort involved there.
Significantly more. And beyond these individual or village-level efforts, the state sometimes supported irrigation too. The sources mention the digging of new canals, nar or nala, and also repairing and maintaining older ones, like the Big Shanar in Punjab during Shah Jahan's reign.
So the state saw the value in it.
Clearly. They recognized how important irrigation was for sustaining and increasing agricultural production, and therefore their revenue base.
Were there other key agricultural technologies in use besides irrigation tools?
Yes, certainly. The wooden plow was absolutely fundamental. Relatively light, easily assembled, usually fitted with an iron tip or coulter. And interestingly, the shallow furrow it created was actually beneficial in that, Climate helped preserve precious moisture in the soil.
Ah, okay.
They also had a kind of drill, pulled by oxen, which could be used for planting seeds in rows, though the simpler method of just broadcasting seed by hand was probably more common across many areas. And for things like hoeing and weeding, simple tools, a narrow iron blade on a small wooden handle. Basic maybe, but essential tech for feeding an empire.
So with these tools and water sources, what kind of crops were they actually growing? You mentioned it wasn't just grains.
Well, agricultural life was largely organized around two main seasonal cycles, which determined what could be grown when. You had the Kharif season, leading to an autumn harvest, and the Rabi season for the spring harvest.
Right.
And this generally meant that most regions of the empire were du fasla, producing at least two crops a year. In areas really blessed with good rainfall or reliable irrigation, they could sometimes even manage 3 harvests.
And this cycle supported enormous crop diversity, you said.
Incredible diversity. The Ain-i Akbari provides some striking figures. It records that the province of Agra alone produced 39 different varieties of crops, Delhi province 43. And maybe most astonishingly, Bengal province listed no fewer than 50 different varieties of rice alone.
50 kinds of rice. It wasn't a monoculture at all.
Not even close. It was a highly varied, highly adapted system of cultivation.
Was all this diversity just about feeding the local population, subsistence farming, or was there also production for the market for trade?
While subsistence was obviously the foundation, the sources clearly indicate a significant orientation towards production for the market and, crucially, for revenue. The state itself and the sources use this term jinsai camel, which means perfect crops.
Ah, the cash crops, basically.
Exactly. These were the crops the state favored because they yielded higher revenue. Cotton and sugarcane were the jinsai camel par excellence. Cotton was huge in central India and the Deccan, fueling that massive textile industry, while Bengal was a major center for sugarcane and sugar export.
Oils.
Other profitable crops included various oil seeds like mustard and lentils. But what's important here is that for the average peasant, subsistence and commercial production weren't totally separate things. They were intertwined. You grew food to eat, yes, but you also allocated land and labor to these jinsai canal to sell, primarily because you needed cash to pay the state's revenue demand.
And the 17th century saw entirely new crops arriving from other parts of the world, changing the agricultural landscape even more.
Yes, a fascinating point of global connection right there in the village fields. Maize, or maca for instance, arrived via Africa and Spain, apparently, and became a major crop, especially in western India. Vegetables like tomatoes, potatoes, chilies, they came from the New World. Fruits like pineapple and papaya, too. These introductions gradually but significantly altered diets and cultivation patterns over time.
And one of these new arrivals has a particularly interesting story of very rapid adoption tobacco.
It really does. The sources show tobacco arriving in the Deccan first, then spreading north incredibly quickly in the early 17th century. The Ain, finished in 1598, doesn't list it for North India, so its arrival is right around the turn of that century.
When did the rulers encounter it?
Akbar and his nobles apparently first encountered it in 1604, and smoking tobacco, often through water pipes, hookahs, or clay pipes, chillums, just caught on with astonishing speed across all levels of society.
Didn't Jahangir try to ban it?
He did.
Hmm?
Emperor Jahangir, apparently worried about its addictive properties, actually attempted to ban it, an effort the sources tell us was totally ineffective.
Huh. A classic historical example of prohibition failing.
Indeed. By the end of the 17th century, tobacco wasn't just something people consumed widely. It had become a major crop in terms of cultivation area and a really important commodity in trade right across India. Its rapid spread just shows how connected and receptive the agrarian economy could be, even to new global products.
And all this varied production, the multiple harvests, the new crops, how did that support the population overall? Was it growing?
Well, this highly varied and flexible agricultural system, it seems it was capable of supporting slow but steady demographic growth. Economic historians, looking at the available data, they've calculated that India's population probably increased by about 50 million people between 1600 and 1800.
50 million, over 200 years.
Yeah, it's a substantial growth, maybe around 33% over those 2 centuries. And that's even factoring in the devastating impact of periodic famines and epidemics, which definitely happened. It suggests the agrarian base was robust enough to accommodate quite a significant increase in population.
Okay, so we have a picture of the land, the crops, the people working it. Now let's look at how those people were organized socially, the fabric of village life, beyond just the individual fields.
Right. So while peasants owned their land individually, as we said, their lives were deeply embedded in a collective village community. The sources highlight sort of three main components to this structure: the cultivators themselves, the village panchayat, and the village headmen.
And is this village community, an equal, egalitarian society?
The sources are very clear on this.
Yeah.
Absolutely not. The cultivators themselves were a highly heterogeneous group, and the village community was marked by deep, pervasive inequities based on caste and similar distinctions.
Right.
We know there was a significant population of people who performed, well, menial tasks and served as agricultural laborers, often called major.
And their status was linked directly to their caste.
Very strongly linked, particularly at the lower levels of the social hierarchy. Despite the theoretical availability of land, many specific caste groups were consistently relegated to performing the most arduous, often considered polluting tasks. Consequently, they were the poorest sections of the rural population with minimal resources. Their lives were severely constrained by their inherited position in the caste hierarchy. The dynamics feel comparable, in some ways, to the situation of Dalits in modern India.
Was this strictly limited to Hindu caste structures?
Not entirely. The sources suggest similar dynamics were at play in Muslim communities as well. For instance, groups like the Halakuran, who performed scavenging tasks, were often forced to live outside the main village boundaries. In places like Bihar, the Malazadas, described as sons of boatmen, were considered comparable in status and condition to slaves.
That paints a really stark picture of social stratification, of ingrained inequality right there within the village itself.
It does. There was a definite correlation. Caste, poverty, low social status, all clustered at the bottom of the hierarchy. However, the sources also note that this correlation wasn't quite as rigid at the intermediate levels.
Oh, how so?
Well, we see examples of Rajputs, who you'd normally associate with higher status, being described as peasants alongside Jats, who had a lower status, places like Marwar. And certain castes, like the Ahirs, Gujars, Melis, they managed to improve their status and wealth, often because they got involved in profitable activities like cattle rearing or horticulture.
So some upward mobility was possible.
Some, yes. In eastern regions, pastoral and fishing castes like the Sadgops and Kaivartis successfully acquired peasant status by moving into agriculture. So while the very bottom of the hierarchy seems quite rigid, there was some degree of mobility and status negotiation possible further up the ladder, often linked to economic success in new niches.
Let's talk about the village governance you mentioned. The panchayat and the headman. How did they function?
Okay, the village panchayat. It was essentially an assembly of the village elders. Now, these weren't just any elders. They were typically the more important, influential individuals in the community, often people who held hereditary property rights.
So, not exactly democratic.
Not at all. While in a mixed caste village, the panchayat might include members from various castes, it definitely functioned as an oligarchy. The sources make it pretty clear it was highly unlikely for menial workers or landless agricultural laborers to be part of this decision-making body.
So power within the village was concentrated among a few influential figures.
Yes, among the more substantial landowners and higher status individuals. And the decisions made by this village panchayat were considered binding on all the villagers.
And the headman, the mukuddam or manal, he was the leader of this group.
Correct. The sources suggest the headman was usually chosen by consensus among these village elders. And interestingly, this choice was often then ratified by the local Zamindar, which highlights the layers of authority involved.
Did the headman have tenure?
Not necessarily secure tenure. His ability to hold office really depended on maintaining the confidence of the elders. They could, potentially, remove him if they lost faith in him. His chief function was crucial: supervising the village accounts, a vital task often performed with the help of the village accountant, the patwari.
So the headman held this position of power and trust, overseeing village finances, but was also accountable to the elders. Still, that position sounds like it could be open to abuse, couldn't it?
Unfortunately, yes. The sources do contain references to the potential for corruption. There are mentions of instances where mandals were accused of misusing their positions, sometimes apparently colluding with the patwari to defraud the village accounts.
How else?
Well, they were also sometimes accused of underassessing the revenue due from their own lands, which were often quite extensive, effectively shifting a larger share of the tax burden onto the smaller, less powerful cultivators.
That's a powerful insight into how inequities could manifest even within the village's own leadership structure. Beyond accounts, what else did the Panchayat handle?
The Panchayat managed a common village fund, which was raised through contributions from the villagers. This fund was used for various purposes. It covered necessary expenses, like entertaining revenue officials who visited the village, making sure their stay was comfortable, hopefully smoothing the tax collection process.
Right, keeping the officials happy.
Exactly. But more positively, it was also used for community welfare, providing assistance to villagers during calamities like floods or famines. And it funded collective construction projects, building a bund to control water, digging a canal infrastructure that was beyond the means of any individual peasant family.
Did the Panchayat have a social role? Or even a judicial one?
Absolutely. A very important function was upholding caste boundaries and norms within the community. Sources from eastern India, for example, note that marriages had to take place in the presence of the mandal, the headman. It was explicitly seen as part of the headman's duty to oversee the conduct of villagers, chiefly to prevent any offense against their caste.
And what power did they have to enforce these social rules?
They had the power to levy fines, and more severely, they could inflict punishment. The most drastic form was expulsion from the community. This was usually for a limited period, but it was a devastating social penalty.
Wow, so...
An outcast individual lost their social standing entirely, and crucially, they lost their right to practice their profession within that community. It was a powerful deterrent against violating accepted caste norms. Now, it's also important to add that in addition to the village panchayat, which governed the collective community, each caste or jati within the village often had its own assembly, the jati panchayat.
So another layer of community governance, but specific to each caste group.
Exactly. And these jati panchayats held considerable power within rural society. This is particularly well documented in the historical records we have from Rajasthan.
What kind of power did these caste-specific assemblies wield? What did they do?
Well, they arbitrated civil disputes, sometimes even those between members of different castes. They mediated claims over land within their own caste group and sometimes beyond. They decided on marriage norms and other social customs specific to their group. They even determined matters of ritual precedence within the broader village context. And the state, for the most part, actually respected the decisions of these jati panchayats, usually only stepping in for matters of serious criminal justice.
So you had this really complex interplay of village-wide governance and caste-specific authority shaping daily life. Given the structure and the potential for exploitation you mentioned earlier from headmen or others, how did ordinary peasants voice grievances? How did they resist oppressive demands?
The archival records, especially from Western India, Rajasthan, Gujarat, Maharashtra, they offer some valuable insights here. They contain actual petitions filed by villagers with the panchayats. And these weren't just about minor squabbles. They reveal serious complaints.
Not what?
Things like extortionate taxation or demands for unpaid labor known as begar, which was often imposed by so-called superior castes, or even by state officials themselves.
And who are typically filing these petitions?
Often, they came from the lowest rungs of the rural hierarchy, the people most vulnerable to exploitation. But sometimes, they were collective petitions brought forward by an entire caste group or a community protesting what they perceived as morally illegitimate demands.
Meaning?
This often included tax demands that were so high they endangered their very subsistence, especially during really difficult times like drought or some other disaster.
Huh.
And the sources reveal a key aspect of the peasants' perspective here. They believed they had a right to a basic minimum necessary for survival, a right they felt was sanctioned by custom, by tradition. They viewed the village panchayat, or sometimes even the state through its officials, as a potential court of appeal. They expected it to uphold its moral obligations, to guarantee justice against excessive demands.
Did these petitions actually work? Did they bring about change?
Yeah. The outcomes seem to have varied considerably. Decisions in conflicts, especially those pitting lower castes against powerful state officials or zamindars, weren't always in the peasants' favor, unsurprisingly. However, compromise was often suggested, either by the panchayat or local officials, particularly when the demands for revenue were clearly deemed excessive or unsustainable.
And if peaceful means like petitioning failed, was there a more drastic form of resistance available to peasants?
Yes, and this was a significant source of leverage for the peasantry, simply deserting the village entirely.
Just leaving?
Yes. When conditions became unbearable, or reconciliation proved impossible, peasants could vote with their feet. And this was a surprisingly effective form of resistance because, as we discussed earlier, there was relatively easy availability of uncultivated land elsewhere in the empire and a constant competition for labor.
So if too many left.
A village's production would plummet. That directly impacted the revenue collected by the state and the income of the local zamindar. This potential for desertion gave the peasants a degree of power, a bargaining chip, through their mobility.
That's a powerful reminder that power wasn't solely top-down. Peasants had their own means, however drastic, of asserting pressure. So the village wasn't just cultivators. There were artisans, too, weren't there?
Absolutely. The village community also included a substantial number of artisans. British-era surveys, looking back at earlier records, particularly from Maharashtra, suggest that artisans could make up as much as 25% a quarter of the total households in some villages.
Wow. Was there a clear line between being a peasant and being an artisan?
Not always. The line was often quite fluid, actually. Many groups performed both agricultural tasks and artisanal work, depending on the season or need. Peasant families themselves, during the periods when intensive field labor wasn't required, would often engage in crafts.
Like what?
Things like dyeing textiles, printing cloth, making pottery, or making and repairing essential tools.
So the craft work often happened during the off-season for farming.
Exactly. It was typically done during the lull periods in the agricultural calendar, the time between sowing and weeding, or between weeding and harvesting. This allowed households to maximize their labor and income throughout the year. Smart adaptation.
How are these specialized services provided by the full-time or part-time artisans compensated? How did they get paid?
There were several common methods. One very common way was a direct share of the harvest. Artisans vital to the village economy, think blacksmiths making and repairing plows or potters making essential vessels, they would receive a fixed share of the grain or other produce at harvest time from the cultivating families they served.
A sort of payment in kind.
Right. Another method was the allotment of land. Artisans might be given a piece of land, possibly carved out from cultivable waste areas, a decision often made by the village panchayat to cultivate for their own subsistence. In Maharashtra, we know these hereditary land holdings for artisans were called miras, or watan. These systems established a long-term, often hereditary relationship between artisan families and the village community, or specific cultivating households, ensuring essential skills were available locally.
Was money involved at all, or was it all based on barter, land, and shares of the harvest?
No, cash remuneration was also known. The sources describe a system of mutually negotiated exchange goods for services. This was later in the colonial period, sometimes referred to as the Jajmani system, although that specific term wasn't really in use during the Mughal era itself.
Do we have examples?
Yes, an 18th century example from Bengal mentions Zamindars paying village artisans like blacksmiths, carpenters, and goldsmiths with a small daily allowance and diet money. That clearly indicates cash payments for their services were part of the mix.
And this links directly to that fascinating observation by the French traveler Jean-Baptiste Tavernier in the 17th century about money in the villages.
It does, absolutely. Tavernier noted something that might surprise us, even today. He observed that even in very small villages in India, he saw the presence of a money changer, known as a shroff.
A banker in a tiny village.
Essentially, yes. These individuals weren't just changing currency, they acted as local bankers. They handled remittances, sending money. And importantly, they could influence the exchange rates between different forms of money. The silver rupia, the copper paisa, and even cowrie shells, which were used for very small transactions. Tavernier's observation is crucial because it definitively shows that a cash nexus, a money economy, was actively present and operating not just in the big towns, but right down at the micro level of the village.
This really seems to push back against that old 19th century British colonial idea of the Indian village as this completely self-sufficient, isolated little republic.
It absolutely contradicts it. That view, often romanticized, portrayed the village as this timeless, unchanging community of equal, fraternal partners just sharing resources and labor. But the sources from the Mughal period really dismantle this picture.
How so?
Well, the presence of individual land ownership, the deep inequities based on caste and gender that we've talked about, and the clear existence of this cash nexus and trade connections all show that it was not some idol of rural egalitarianism.
So the little republic idea just glossed over the internal power structures.
Precisely. As we discussed, a group of powerful individuals, the village elders on the Panchayat, made the decisions and dispensed justice. And the sources indicate they could, and sometimes did, exploit the weaker sections of the community. Furthermore, the village economy wasn't isolated at all. It was increasingly linked into a broader cash nexus through trade with towns.
And the state's demands push this too.
Definitely. In the Mughal heartland, land revenue was assessed and very often collected in cash. That meant peasants had to sell their produce or otherwise engage in the money economy just to meet the state's demands. Artisans producing for export or cultivators growing those cash crops, the jinsai camel, they received advances or wages in cash. The village was an integral part of a larger, more dynamic, and increasingly monetized economy.
It's a picture of a far more integrated and complex rural life than that simplistic colonial view ever suggested. Let's shift our focus now to another crucial layer of rural society, one often less visible in historical accounts than the men, but absolutely vital to the agrarian economy. Women. What do the sources tell us about their lives and roles?
Well, the sources make it very clear that agricultural production wasn't just men's work. It was a joint enterprise. It involved both men and women performing specific, often complementary roles. They worked, as some texts imply, shoulder to shoulder in the fields.
What were their specific tasks, typically?
While men generally performed the heavier tasks, like tilling the soil and plowing the fields, women were actively involved in really crucial stages of cultivation. Sowing the seeds, the backbreaking work of weeding, threshing the grain after harvest, and winnowing it to separate the chaff.
So, essential labor.
Absolutely essential. With the prevalence of this individualized peasant farming based on household units, the success of production literally depended on the labor and resources of the entire household. That means the contributions of both men and women were indispensable.
So, for these peasant families, the idea of a strict separation, the home as a female space and the outside world as a purely male space, that wasn't really possible.
Exactly. The economic necessity of their labor right there in the fields meant that a strict gendered segregation, like the system of purdah, which was more common among elite urban families, was generally just not feasible or practiced in these agrarian communities.
But despite working side by side in production, were there still societal biases or restrictions related to gender?
Yes, the sources indicate that biases, often connected to women's biological functions, persisted, even alongside their vital economic contribution. For example, some sources mention restrictions in Western India, where menstruating women were not allowed to touch the plow, or, interestingly, the potter's wheel.
Really?
Yes. Similarly, in Bengal, there were apparently norms forbidding them from entering betel leaf groves. These were specific restrictions, likely tied to ideas of ritual purity, that existed alongside their essential labor in many other agricultural tasks.
What about women's involvement in that artisanal production we talked about earlier? Were they involved there too?
Yes, women's labor was also absolutely crucial in many artisanal activities linked to the village economy. Tasks like spinning yarn for weaving hugely important sifting and kneading clay for pottery, embroidery. These were heavily dependent on female labor. The sources even suggest a correlation. The more commercialized a particular product became, the greater the demand often was for women's labor in its production process. And, like men, women involved in artisanal production didn't necessarily work only within their own homes. They might go to the houses of employers or even to local markets if their labor or products were needed there.
Beyond their labor in fields and crafts, women were also seen as vital for just perpetuating the household, the labor force itself, weren't they?
Yes, in a society so heavily reliant on human labor, women were considered an extremely important resource. Why? Because they were the childbearers, essential for replenishing and hopefully growing the population of the workforce. And given the tragically high mortality rates from malnutrition, frequent pregnancies, childbirth itself, there was often, the sources suggest, a shortage of wives in peasant and artisan communities.
And how did this demographic reality influence social customs, particularly around marriage?
It led to customs in these peasant and artisan communities that were quite distinct from the practices you'd see among the elite. For instance, instead of the system of dowry, common among higher social strata where the bride's family pays, the payment of a bride price to the bride's family was prevalent in many rural communities.
A reversal of the flow of wealth.
In a sense, yes. Also, remarriage was generally considered legitimate, was commonly accepted for both divorced women and widows. These practices seem like pragmatic adaptations, really, helping ensure that households could acquire wives, continue their lineage, and maintain their essential labor force in the face of demographic pressures.
But despite their obvious importance for labor and reproduction, you mentioned control over women was also a significant concern for the society.
It certainly was. The sources suggest there was a considerable fear of losing control over women, precisely because they were such vital resources. The household was typically male-headed, the norm was patriarchal, and women were subject to strict control not just by their male family members, but also by the community as a whole,
Yeah.
often enforced through the village panchayat.
And punishments could be harsh.
Yes, severe, even draconian punishments could be meted out for suspected infidelity, reflecting the premium placed on controlling female sexuality and ensuring the purity of the lineage.
Did women have any avenue for seeking justice or redress if they faced mistreatment or neglect within this clearly patriarchal structure?
Yes, and this is another fascinating insight we get from those archival records, particularly again from Western India, Rajasthan, Gujarat, Maharashtra. These documents contain petitions filed by women themselves. They went to the village panchayats seeking redress or justice.
What kinds of issues were they bringing forward?
It wasn't just about, say, physical mistreatment, though that likely occurred. Wives petitioned the panchayat protesting against their husband's infidelity, or, notably, against a husband's neglect of his wife and children, essentially accusing him of failing in his duties as the grihasti, the male head of the household, to provide for his family.
How did the panchayats or other authorities handle such petitions, especially those concerning male infidelity or neglect?
Interestingly, male infidelity itself wasn't always directly punished by the panchayat. However, the state, or representatives of superior caste groups, did sometimes intervene. But their focus wasn't necessarily on enforcing marital fidelity for men. It was more about ensuring that the neglected wife and children were adequately provided for by the husband. The priority seems to have been maintaining the basic economic integrity and subsistence of the family unit.
And there's a small but really telling detail in these records about how the women petitioners were identified, isn't there?
Yes, and it speaks volumes about their status. Even in the official record keeping, often when women filed these petitions, their individual names were just excluded. They were referred to only by their relationship to the male head of the household, identified as the mother, sister, or wife of the male head.
Wow. So even in the act of seeking official justice, their individual identity could be erased in the documentation.
It really underscores the broader societal biases they faced, even when using the available mechanisms for redress.
Was the situation regarding property rights different for women in the landed elite, the Zamindar families, compared to peasant women?
Yes, it appears to have been quite different, significantly so. For women belonging to that landed gentry class, the families of Zamindars, the sources indicate they generally did have the right to inherit property.
And manage it.
Yes. Documents from Punjab, for instance, show women, including widows, actively participating in the rural land market, selling or mortgaging property they had inherited. Both Hindu and Muslim women from Zamindar families could inherit Zamindaris themselves, and they seem to have been free to sell or mortgage these holdings.
Are there specific examples?
There are well-documented examples of women Zamindars in 18th century Bengal, including one particularly famous case of a woman who headed the very large and influential Rajshahi Zamindari. This suggests a really significant difference in property rights and economic agency for women of the landed elite compared to the limitations faced by peasant women, whose property rights, while existing, were often much more tied to their household and subject to community control.
So the agrarian world wasn't just cultivated fields and village settlements. You mentioned earlier that forests covered huge areas. What do the sources tell us about these regions and the people who lived in them?
Yeah, it's absolutely crucial to remember that rural India extended far beyond sedentary agriculture. The sources really emphasize the presence of huge swaths of forests right across the subcontinent. Contemporary estimates put the average forest cover at something like 40% of the total area.
40%? That's huge.
It is. And these weren't uniform either. They included everything from dense forests called jangal to scrubland or karbandi. And they were located across diverse regions, eastern and central India, the Terai region up in the north, Sharkand, and down south in the western Ghats and the Deccan Plateau.
And the people living in these vast areas were referred to as jungli in the texts.
Yes, contemporary texts use the term jungli to refer to forest dwellers. Now, it's important we don't read this term with modern connotations of, uncivilized or savage. It simply described people whose livelihood was primarily derived from the forest. Through gathering forests produce things like honey, beeswax, herbs, lac. Through hunting, and also through practicing shifting agriculture, where they'd clear a patch of forest, cultivate it for a few seasons, and then move on to a new area, allowing the old one to regenerate.
And their lives were often defined by seasonal movement, weren't they, following the resources?
Absolutely. Their activities were largely season-specific, and this dictated their mobility. For example, sources describing the Bill people mention them spending spring collecting forest produce, summer focused on fishing, the monsoon months engaged in cultivation, and then autumn and winter dedicated to hunting. This sequence of seasonal activities perpetuated their mobility, a really defining characteristic that distinguished them from the more settled, sedentary peasant communities.
How did the Mughal state view these extensive forest areas and their inhabitants, from the perspective of Agra or Delhi?
Well, from the state's perspective, the forest was often seen as a bit subversive. A refuge, or malwas, for those who resisted imperial authority, rebels, troublemakers, tax avoiders. Babur, again in his memoirs, comments on this directly. He notes that jungles provided a good defense behind which people became stubbornly rebellious and pay no taxes. The state saw these areas as potentially outside their full control, difficult to penetrate and govern effectively.
But the state did interact with these regions and make inroads into them. What were the main reasons for that?
There were several reasons. The state had practical needs, for instance, elephants for the imperial army. Forest regions were a primary source of these crucial animals, and the peshkash, the tribute demanded from forest peoples, often included a supply of elephants. So there's a direct economic and military link right there.
Elephants for war.
Exactly. And the Mughal political ideology of the hunt also played a role. Court historians like Abul Fazl portrayed the imperial hunt, especially those large organized drives, as a symbolic act. It demonstrated the emperor's power, his reach, and his concern, supposedly, to connect with all his subjects, even those in remote forest areas.
So it was partly PR.
Partly symbolic assertion of authority, yes. Hunting expeditions allowed the emperor and his massive retinue to travel across vast, sometimes difficult territories, and, in theory, attend to people's grievances and just assert the state's presence. It was a frequent subject in court paintings, which often included these little symbolic scenes within the main hunt depiction, representing harmonious reign or the imposition of state control and justice.
So the hunt was both practical for resources like elephants and symbolic for asserting authority.
Precisely. But perhaps the most significant and disruptive intrusion into forest areas was the ongoing process of forest clearance for agricultural expansion. This was a continuous pressure throughout the period.
How do we know about that?
The Chandimangala, a Bengali poem from the 16th century, gives us a vivid literary description of this. It tells the story of a hero, Kalaketu, who clears a forest to establish a new kingdom. The poem describes outsiders arriving with tools, knives, axes, pikes, chanting prayers, clearing the forest, establishing markets. And the image of the tigers running away powerfully illustrates the disruption, the colonization from the perspective of the forest environment and its original inhabitants.
That's quite a picture.
It is. And the text even refers to these incoming people, including figures named Das and Zafarmian, as foreigners from the perspective of the forest world, highlighting that sense of intrusion.
That definitely contrasts with the symbolic harmony sometimes depicted in those imperial hunt paintings. What about trade? Was there trade between the forest dwellers and the plains?
Yes, absolutely. Commercial agriculture and the growing towns created demand for forest products. Things like honey, beeswax, gumlac. They were collected in the forests and traded with the plains. Gumlac actually became a major overseas export commodity in the 17th century, and the capture and sale of elephants were also economically significant.
How did this trade work?
Through various means, barter, certainly, but also commodity exchange involving money. Some tribal groups even became specialized in this trade. The Lohanis in the Punjab, for example, were heavily involved in the overland trade routes connecting India with Afghanistan, and also in facilitating trade between towns and the countryside, acting as intermediaries.
And Abu Fazl in the Ain, he provides details on this trade too, doesn't he? Specifically for Awadh province.
He does. It's fascinating. He lists the goods brought down from the mountains, things like gold, copper, lead, musk, yak tails, honey, various herbs and spices like chuck, pomegranate seed, ginger, pepper, midgeth root for dyeing, borax, zedawari wax, woolens, woodenware, even various birds of prey.
How did they transport all that?
He notes they were transported on the backs of men, of stout ponies, and of goats, which tells you something about the difficult terrain and the simple yet effective modes of transport used. And he also lists the goods carried back into the hills from the plains, things like white and colored cloths, amber, salt, asafoetida ornaments, glass, earthenware.
So a two-way exchange.
Definitely. It shows that forest dwellers weren't isolated. They were connected to the broader economy, trading valuable resources for manufactured goods and commodities they needed or desired.
Were there also social or political transformations happening among the forest dwellers during this period, driven by these interactions?
Yes, social factors were certainly changing their lives. Just like the villages had their big men, or leading individuals, tribes also had chieftains. And over time, particularly as agricultural expansion encroached and the state sought to incorporate these areas more formally, many tribal chiefs successfully transitioned. Some became recognized as Zamindars by the Mughal state, fitting into that existing structure of landed power. Others went even further and established themselves as independent or semi-independent kings. The Ain actually notes that this process of tribal chiefs becoming kings had become fully developed by the 16th century.
And establishing kingdoms meant they needed armies, linking back to the state's need for military resources and control.
Precisely. These newly powerful chiefs and kings needed armies. They often recruited them from their own lineage groups or demanded military service from their tribal fraternity in exchange for land or other rights. The sources mention examples, like tribes in the Sindh region, who could apparently field substantial armies, 6,000 cavalry, 7,000 infantry. In Assam, the Ahom kings had a system where Paiks, basically peasant soldiers, rendered military service in exchange for land grants. And the capture of wild elephants was a strict royal monopoly, a key resource. War was common in these frontier zones, with kings like the Koch rulers subjugating neighboring tribes to expand their power. And beyond political changes, cultural influences also penetrated these areas. Some historians suggest that Sufi saints, the Pirs, played a significant role in the slow process of the acceptance of Islam among the agricultural communities that were emerging in these newly colonized forest areas. It illustrates how religious and cultural shifts often accompany the economic and political changes happening on the frontier.
So the forests were really dynamic, integrated zones, not just static, isolated wildlands. Now let's turn to that really powerful group you've mentioned repeatedly, positioned sort of between the peasants and the state, the Zamindars.
Right, the Zamindars. They were a distinct and extremely powerful class in Mughal agrarian society. They lived off agriculture, absolutely, but unlike the peasants, they were not directly involved in the physical labor of cultivation themselves. They were essentially landed proprietors who enjoyed significant social and economic privileges.
What gave them their elevated status and power? Where did it come from?
Several factors contributed. Their caste was often important. Upper castes, particularly a combination of Brahmanas and Rajputs, were prominent among Zamindars, but the class also included individuals from intermediate castes, and there were significant Muslim Zamindaris as well. They also often performed certain services, khidmat for the state, maybe maintaining local order or assisting in revenue collection, and this enhanced their status.
But their real power was land and resources.
Primarily, yes. It stemmed from their control over land and resources. First, they held extensive personal lands called milkiyat. This term literally means property, and these lands were cultivated purely for their private use, often employing hired labor or even forms of servile labor. And crucially, they had the right to sell, bequeath, or mortgage these milkiyat lands freely. That gave them significant economic agency.
So they were major landowners in their own right, separate from collecting revenue from other people's land.
Exactly. And in addition to their milkiyat lands, they often held the authority to collect revenue from other cultivators on behalf of the state, for which they received financial compensation, a share, or commission. But perhaps their most defining characteristic and a major source of their independent power was their control over military resources.
Military resources?
Yes. Most Zamindars possessed their own fortresses, little forts called kilachas, and they maintained their own armed contingents ranging from cavalry and infantry to sometimes even artillery pieces.
Private armies. That sounds like a tremendous source of independent power, potentially quite challenging for the central state to manage.
It was, absolutely. The Ain-i Akbari, in its detailed statistical tables, provides figures for the combined military strength of Zamindars right across the empire, and the numbers are just astonishing.
That's astonishing.
It lists the combined total of 384,558 cavalry, over 4.2 million infantry, 1,863 elephants, 4,260 cannons, and 4,500 boats.
Wow, that's practically a parallel army to the state's own forces.
It really highlights the truly massive independent military power and potential strength concentrated in the hands of this Zamindar class. They weren't just landowners, they were significant military players in their own right, a force the state always had to reckon with.
Where did these Zamindaris originate? Were they all ancient aristocratic lineages going back centuries?
Well, contemporary documents offer different pictures. Some give the impression that certain Zamindaris originated through outright conquest, a powerful military chieftain just dispossessing weaker local people. However, the sources also suggest it's kind of unlikely the Mughal state would have officially sanctioned this without issuing an imperial order, a sanad.
So conquest wasn't the main way.
Probably not the only way, and maybe not the most common. More importantly, the sources better document what historians call the slow processes of zamindari consolidation.
Tell us about those slow processes. What did they involve?
They included things like spearheading the colonization of new lands, bringing forest areas or wasteland into cultivation. This was a role the Zamindars actively played, often helping settle cultivators, providing them with resources, maybe even cash loans to get started. They also acquired zamindari rights through state orders or grants. And significantly, zamindaris were bought and sold quite briskly during this period.
So you could actually buy your way into the Zamindar class. It wasn't purely hereditary.
Exactly. The fact that zamindaris were commercialized, treated as property that could be purchased, allowed individuals from relatively lower castes, if they accumulated enough wealth, to acquire zamindar status. It demonstrates a degree of social mobility even within this elite group, linked directly to economic power. We also see the consolidation of clan or lineage-based Zamindars, Rajput, and Jat lineages in northern India expanding their territorial control, or even peasant pastoralist groups like the Sadgops in Bengal establishing significant zamindaris over time.
Beyond their role as revenue collectors and military leaders, what was the economic role of Zamindars in the wider agrarian system?
Well, as we just mentioned, they played a crucial leadership role in agricultural expansion, spearheading colonization, settling cultivators. Their active involvement in the buying and selling of zamindaris also significantly accelerated the process of monetization in the countryside, pushing more lands and transactions into the cash economy. Furthermore, they generated income by selling the produce from their often extensive milkiyat lands. And they frequently established local markets, or hats, where peasants could also come to sell their surplus produce and engage in trade. This further integrated the village into the broader regional economy.
Now, you initially referred to them quite starkly as an exploitative class. What was their ultimate relationship with the peasantry living under them? Was it purely exploitative?
Yes, they were undeniably an exploitative class in the structural sense. They extracted surplus wealth from the producers, the peasants, they collected revenue, often imposed additional cesses or other demands, and benefited from labor performed on their own lands. But you A and C, and this is a really important nuance the sources reveal, there was also often an element of reciprocity, paternalism, and patronage in this relationship.
That seems like a contradiction. How can you be both exploitative and, well, paternalistic?
It points to a complex, perhaps ambivalent dynamic. There are two main pieces of evidence from the sources that support this idea of a relationship that wasn't purely antagonistic. First, the Bhakti saints, those popular religious figures who were often powerful voices against oppression. They didn't typically portray zamindars, or interestingly moneylenders, as the primary exploiters of the peasantry. Their most biting criticism was more often directed at the state's revenue officials, the imperial agents sent down from the center to collect taxes.
They blamed the outsiders more.
It seems that way sometimes. Second, and perhaps even more telling, in many of the major agrarian uprisings that occurred in North India during the 17th century, the Zamindars often received support from the peasantry in their struggles against the state.
Really? Peasants siding with Zamindars against the government?
Yes. This indicates that despite the inherent exploitation in the landlord-peasant relationship, peasants sometimes saw common cause with their local zamindars against the demands and pressures of the central Mughal government. It wasn't a simple binary of oppressor and oppressed. There were shifting alliances, shared interests, or common antagonisms against a third party, the state.
That relationship is much more complex than a simple hierarchy suggests. So let's move to that third party then, the apex of the whole system. The Mughal state itself and its fundamental need for land revenue.
Absolutely fundamental. Revenue derived from the land was, without exaggeration, the economic mainstay of the entire Mughal Empire. It was the source of funding for everything. The massive army, the complex bureaucracy, the glittering court, all state activities. Without effective revenue collection, the empire simply couldn't function, let alone expand.
And to get that revenue from such a vast and diverse territory, the state had to build an enormous administrative apparatus, didn't it?
It absolutely had to. The state needed mechanisms to, first, try and control production, then fix the amount of revenue due from each area, and finally, ensure its collection right across its vast and expanding territories. At the very top of this fiscal system was the office of the Diwan, the chief financial minister, responsible for supervising the entire revenue system.
And locally.
Down at the local level, you had revenue officials and record keepers like the amins, who were state agents penetrating deep into the agricultural domain. Their actions, their decisions, their assessments, they became decisive agents in shaping the actual agrarian relations on the ground between the state, the Zamindars, and the peasants.
How did the state go about figuring out how much revenue was actually owed from a particular piece of land or village?
Well, the state's first step was always to try and acquire specific information about the land being cultivated and its potential produce. This ideally involved measurement in each province. The Ain-i Akbari, as we know, provides aggregate data based on measurements conducted during Akbar's reign, and these efforts at detailed measurement continued, or were supposed to continue, under later emperors.
There's that specific order from Aurangzeb you mentioned earlier, highlighting the state's continued focus on this.
Yes, in 1665, Aurangzeb issued this really detailed order instructing his amins, his revenue assessors, to conduct meticulous surveys. He wanted them to discover the actual conditions of cultivation, the Mawjudat village by village, even peasant by peasant.
A semi-war. Why such detail?
He wanted this minute scrutiny to assess the revenue demand, the jama, while taking into account both the government's financial interests, kifayat, and, importantly, he mentions the welfare of the peasantry. This emphasis on detailed, ground-level information and the explicit mention of peasant welfare suggests two things. First, the state understood, at least theoretically, that its long-term revenue base depended on the survival and relative well-being of the cultivators. And second, it highlights just how difficult it probably was to get accurate information from such a vast, complex territory.
But not all areas were subjected to this kind of detailed measurement, were they?
No. The sources indicate that those vast forest areas we discussed earlier remained largely unmeasured and effectively outside this systematic revenue assessment system for much of the period.
The Ain also famously classified land for revenue purposes based on how frequently it was cultivated. Can you remind us about that?
Yes, Abul Fasil details Akbar's quite sophisticated system of land classification. It was based on cultivation frequency, and the idea was to create a fairer, more predictable assessment based on productivity. Polaj land was the best cultivated annually for every crop, never left fallow. Parauti land was left fallow temporarily, maybe for a year or two, to recover its strength. Chachar land had been fallow for 3 or 4 years, and Branjar land was land uncultivated for 5 years more.
And how did they assess the revenue for the regularly cultivated lands, the Polaj and Parauti? You said it sounded complex?
It was a complex but in theory systematic method. These regularly cultivated lands were further classified into 3 categories based on their quality: good, middling, and bad. The state would then calculate the average produce of these 3 classes for a particular crop in that area. Then 1/3 of this calculated average produce was taken as the median produce. And finally, 1/3 of that median produce was determined to be the royal dues, the state's share.
Okay, wait, so 1/3 of the average and then 1/3 of that. That sounds like 1/9 of the average total produce. Or am I misunderstanding?
That's one way to look at the final fraction, yes, though the official method involved those steps. Yeah. Averaging the good, middling, bad, taking 1/3 of that average as the medium, and then taking 1/3 of that medium as the state's share. The principles behind this rather convoluted system seem to be about creating a standardized assessment based on the land's inherent potential productivity and its current cultivation status, providing a framework for the state's revenue demand that wasn't just arbitrary.
Okay, so once the revenue amount was assessed, the jama, how was it actually collected, the hasil? Was it always in cash?
Well, Akbar's decree, as recorded in the Ain, explicitly instructed the revenue collector, the Emil Guzar, to strive for payment in cash, Naki. The state definitely preferred cash. It was easier to store, easier to transport, easier to distribute, especially to pay the salaries of officials or grant assignments like jagirs. But payment in kind, paying with actual harvested crops, was also explicitly allowed as an option. This acknowledges the realities of a largely agrarian economy, where access to ready cash might be limited for many peasants at certain times or in certain regions. The state's goal was always to maximize its claim, the jama, but the actual collection, the hazelzil, sometimes fell short, depending on the harvest, local conditions, resistance, all sorts of factors.
And the Ain actually details specific methods for collection when it was done in kind if they weren't getting cash.
Yes, it outlined several methods used to estimate or divide the harvest when collecting in kind. There was kankut, can meaning grain, cut meaning estimates. This involved estimating the yield based on the standing crop before harvesting. If there was doubt, They might cut and estimate from 3 separate sample lots representing good, middling, and inferior yields. Then there was batai, also called bauli. This involved reaping and stacking the crops first, and then physically dividing the harvested produce by agreement, right there in front of the relevant parties. Abul Fazl notes this method required intelligent inspectors to prevent deception.
I bet. What else?
There was ketbatai, which was the practice of dividing the actual fields after they had been sown, with the state simply claiming the produce from its allocated portion of the field. And finally, langbatai, where after cutting, the grain was formed into heaps and then divided between the state and the cultivator.
Those methods sound incredibly involved, requiring negotiation, trust, oversight right there at the village level. It highlights how hands-on revenue collection could be, how much it depended on local officials and interactions.
They were very much grounded in the realities of the harvest cycle, yes. Each method had its pros and cons, and could impact cultivators differently in terms of fairness, risk, and transparency. The variety of methods also suggests the system needed flexibility, adapting to local practices, different crop types, or specific agreements made on the ground.
And as you mentioned earlier, this entire complex land revenue system, the assessment, the collection, the officials, it was inextricably linked to the Mughal administrative and military structure, wasn't it? The Mansabdari system.
Absolutely. The revenue collected from the land was the fuel, the absolute lifeblood for the Mansabdari system, which formed the military bureaucratic elite at the empire's apex. While a minority of these high-ranking officials, the Mansabdars, were paid directly in cash, nagi, from the central treasury, the vast majority were paid through assignments of revenue from specific territories. These assignments were called jagirs.
Right.
And these jagirs were frequently transferred from one Mansabdar to another. This was a deliberate state policy designed to prevent them from developing strong local roots and potentially challenging imperial authority. The entire system, the ranks, the military obligations, the functioning of the elite relied completely on the state's ability to effectively assess and, crucially, collect land revenue from that vast agrarian base through all the complex mechanisms we've just discussed.
So the rural economy was the essential foundation that directly funded the empire's powerful military and administrative elite. And fascinatingly, this foundation wasn't just local or even regional. It was increasingly tied into a genuinely global economic system.
That's one of the most striking insights you get when you view the sources collectively, looking beyond just India. The Mughal Empire existed within a world of other powerful, large territorial empires. In the 16th and 17th centuries, you had Ming China, Safavid Iran, the Ottoman Turkey, and the relative political stability within these empires fostered incredibly vibrant overland trade networks, connecting Europe, Asia, and Africa in complex ways.
And then the European voyages of discovery changed this global picture significantly, added sea routes to the mix.
Massively. The opening of sea routes around Africa and, of course, the European colonization of the New World led to a huge expansion of Asia's trade, and especially India's trade, with Europe. This resulted not only in a greater volume of trade, but it also expanded its geographical reach and the sheer variety of commodities being exchanged globally.
And how were European powers primarily paying for all those desirable goods they wanted from India? The textiles, the spices, the indigo?
This is the absolutely crucial point for understanding the Mughal economy during this period. Europeans had relatively few goods that India wanted or needed in large quantities. So to pay for the vast amounts of commodities they procured from India, they primarily used silver bullion, silver coins, and bars.
Silver from the Americas, mostly.
A huge amount of it originated there, yes. And because India itself lacked significant natural silver resources, a large part of that bullion gravitated towards India. This massive influx of silver was, in many ways, highly beneficial for the Indian economy. It provided it with a much-needed precious metal for coinage and trade.
So India became this major global destination, almost a sink for the world's silver. What was the impact of this influx domestically?
It led to a period of really remarkable monetary stability in India, lasting roughly from the 16th to the 18th centuries, particularly in the consistent availability of metal currency, most notably the silver rupiah. You can see this consistency if you look at the coins minted under Akbar, or later under Aurangzeb. And this monetary stability fueled an unprecedented expansion of coin minting and a massive increase in the circulation of money throughout the economy, reaching further down into society than ever before.
Which, as we just discussed, perfectly dovetailed with the state's preference for collecting revenue in cash. The two things reinforced each other.
Exactly. The increased availability of silver and the resulting deep monetization of the economy were absolutely essential enablers for the Mughal state's ability to effectively assess and collect its taxes and revenue in cash from its agrarian base. You could say the global flow of silver facilitated the state's preferred method of extraction.
There's that really vivid account from the Italian traveler Giovanni Carreri writing around 1690, which spells out these global connections and the flow of silver in amazing detail.
Yes. Carreri's account, which was based partly on the observations of the earlier French traveler François Bernier, it offers this truly panoramic view of how global wealth was circulating and where it was ending up. He famously stated that basically all the gold and silver circulating in the world seemed to find its way eventually to India.
How did he describe that process? Where did it come from?
He traces the path very clearly. Silver from the Americas flows into Europe. From Europe, it's sent partly into Turkey, the Ottoman Empire, to pay for their commodities, and partly into Persia via ports like Smyrna, often to buy Persian silk. Then he notes, because the Turks, Persians, Arabians, and others needed commodities from India, he specifically mentions coffee from Yemen, which was traded onwards, they would send vast quantities of money to ports like Mocha on the Red Sea and Basra in the Persian Gulf. And from there, it was loaded onto ships and sent directly to Hindustan, to India.
So, multiple routes converging on India.
Yes, and that wasn't the only way. He also highlights that Indian, Dutch, English, and Portuguese ships carrying Indian commodities out to places across Southeast Asia, Pegu, Tanasseri, Siam or Ceylon, Sri Lanka, the Maldives, Mozambique, and Africa, and other locations. Those ships had to bring gold and silver from those regions back to India to facilitate trade.
Even from Japan.
He even notes that silver the Dutch extracted from mines in Japan eventually, sooner or later, goes to Hindustan. And of course, the European powers themselves, France, England, Portugal, the goods they carried back to Europe were purchased primarily using ready money, which remains there in India.
That account is just phenomenal. It paints India as this massive economic magnet at the center of global trade networks, drawing in silver from the Americas, Europe, the Middle East, Africa, Southeast Asia, East Asia, everywhere.
It absolutely does. Carreri's testimony provides powerful evidence of the enormous amount of wealth flowing into the Mughal Empire during the 17th century. And it points to the phenomenal amounts of cash and commodity transactions happening throughout India during this period. It's a direct, tangible connection between these massive, macro-level global economic forces and the increased circulation of money that reached right down to influence daily life, agricultural production patterns, and revenue collection methods in the villages we started with.
It really highlights how the local agrarian economy, which seems so grounded, was actually part of something much, much larger and interconnected. And all of this incredible detail, so much of our understanding comes back time and again to that unique foundational document, the Ain-i Akbari. Let's just take a moment to appreciate how truly remarkable this source is.
It really is an extraordinary historical document. The Ain-i Akbari, authored by Abul Faisal Alami. It wasn't just a piece of history writing. It was the culmination of this huge historical and administrative project initiated by Emperor Akbar himself. It was finally completed in 1598, and remarkably, Abul Faisal revised it 5 times, 5 revisions. That suggests a real, sustained effort towards accuracy, verification, and presenting information authentically, at least as he saw it.
It wasn't a standalone work, was it? It was part of something bigger.
No, exactly. It was actually the 3rd book of a much larger historical project commissioned by Akbar, known as the Akbarnama. The first 2 books of the Akbarnama focus much more on historical narratives detailing the events of Akbar's reign, his conquests, political life, the usual stuff in chronicles. The Ain, the 3rd book, shifted focus entirely. It was designed as this comprehensive compendium of the empire's regulations, its administration, and it served as a detailed gazetteer of all its provinces.
What kind of information does it actually contain? What's in it?
Its scope is just vast and really unprecedented for its time in India. It provides incredibly detailed accounts of the organization of the imperial court, the administrative structure of the empire, the army, sources of revenue. It lays out the physical layout and administrative divisions of the provinces, the subas. But significantly, it goes way beyond just administration. It includes descriptions of the literary, cultural, and religious traditions of the people of India. That was a major departure from earlier Persian chronicles, which focus almost exclusively on political and dynastic events.
Right.
And crucially for our deep dive today, it contains this immense amount of intricate quantitative information statistics, numbers detailing facts about the provinces alongside the descriptions of government departments and the subas.
And how is all this information structured within the Ain itself? How is it organized?
It's divided into 5 books known as dafters. The first book, Mughal Empire, details the imperial household. The second, sixteenth Akbari, covers the military and civil administration, including accounts of the servants of the state, sketches of officials like the Zamindars, and mentions of learned men, poets, artists.
And the third book is the one most valuable for understanding the agrarian society.
Absolutely. The third book, Mughal Empire, is the heart of the fiscal side of the empire. It contains that rich quantitative data on revenue rates. And within this book is the famous Account of the 12 Provinces, which provides incredibly detailed statistical information for each suba.
What kind of stats?
Geographic and topographic details, the economic profile of the province and its administrative divisions, the sarkars, parganas, and mahals, and crucially, the total measured area and the assessed revenue, the jamma, for each of these divisions.
And it gets even more granular than the province level, down to the sarkar level.
Yes. The tables presented at the sarkar level within Mughal Empire are perhaps the most remarkable part. They typically contain 8 columns of specific information for each subdivision within the sarkar. The names of the parganas or mahals, any forts, kila located there, the measured area, harazi and zemini pamuda, the cash revenue assessed naki, details of any charity grants, sura rugal, allocated from that revenue, information about the zamindars present in that area, and most uniquely, the castes of those zamindars and the details of the military troops they were expected to maintain: horsemen, sawar, foot soldiers, piada, and even elephants fill.
Wow.
It provides this incredibly fascinating, detailed, and highly complex snapshot of agrarian society, particularly in northern India where the data seems most complete. The 4th and 5th books are shorter and cover religious, literary, and cultural traditions, along with a collection of Akbar's wise sayings.
It sounds like a truly monumental task to compile all of that information. How on earth did Abul Fazl gather it all?
Abul Fazl himself actually describes his meticulous process in a source excerpt we have, and it highlights the immense effort involved. He states he receives a sublime mandate from Akbar to write this history, encompassing the emperor's glorious events and dominion-conquering victories. For the administrative and statistical data specifically, he says he spent much labor and research.
What did that involve?
He describes interrogating state servants and older family members who had served the empire for a long time. He interviewed prudent, truth-speaking old men and active-minded, right-action young ones, and he reduced their statements to writing. So it suggests he used oral testimony as a significant source.
And there is an official process as well, gathering documents.
Yes, he describes royal commands being sent out to the provinces, requesting notes and memoranda from officials with old service, people who had knowledge of past events and local conditions. Then a second command was apparently issued for these collected materials to be recited in the royal hearing, presumably before Akbar, and supplements were added based on this feedback and verification process.
What about his own efforts?
Personally, Abul Fazl utilized the official chronicle of events, which was maintained at the record office established early in Akbar's reign. He also procured originals or copies of imperial orders that had been sent out to the provinces over the years. He incorporated reports from ministers and high officials, and he speaks generally of collecting notes from sagacious and well-informed men. He uses this wonderful metaphor of constructing a reservoir for irrigating and moistening the rose garden of fortune, which really conveys the immense effort required to gather and synthesize this vast collection of data from so many diverse sources: official documents, oral history, personal inquiries.
Given the scale, the multiple sources, the potential for error, how reliable do historians consider the Ain as a historical source today? Can we trust it?
Well, while it was clearly officially sponsored by the emperor, historians generally view it as more than just a simple compilation of official papers scraped together. Abul Fazl's mention of those 5 revisions, his described methods of cross-checking oral testimonies, and even the practice of transcribing quantitative data in words rather than numerals to minimize later copying errors, all suggest a genuine effort toward achieving a high degree of authenticity and reliability within the framework of the state's perspective, of course.
But are there known limitations, problems that historians have identified?
Yes, absolutely. No source is perfect, especially one this ambitious, Historians have found numerous errors in totaling within the statistical tables, mostly simple arithmetic or transcription slips likely made by assistants over time, but they exist. These are generally considered minor and don't usually invalidate the overall data trends, but they require careful handling by anyone using the numbers.
What about bigger issues?
More significant limitations include the fact that the quantitative data is not uniformly rich or complete across all provinces. For example, that really valuable caste data for Zamindars is unfortunately missing for major provinces like Bengal and Orissa. Also, while the fiscal data on revenue assessment is incredibly detailed, other vital economic parameters like market prices and wages are much less well documented in the Ain. And the price and wage data that is available is mainly for the area around the capital, Agra, limiting its direct applicability across the rest of the vast empire.
So it's not a perfect, unblemished mirror of reality. But despite these limitations, why is it still considered such an extraordinary document? What makes it so special?
Because despite its flaws, despite its inherent imperial perspective, it represents a major transformative breakthrough in historical record-keeping in India for its time. Earlier medieval chroniclers, as we said, focused almost entirely on political events, the reigns of kings, wars, conquests, court intrigue. They might mention the country, its people, its products, but usually only incidentally as background to the main political narrative.
And the Ain fundamentally changed that approach.
Radically. The Ain was arguably the first document of its kind in India to deliberately set out to record detailed information about the empire and the people of India as a subject worthy of systematic study in itself, not just as scenery for political events. It provides these fascinating, unparalleled insights into the structure and organization of the Mughal Empire and invaluable quantitative data on products, populations, and administrative divisions.
Especially for agrarian history.
Especially. Its quantitative evidence for agrarian relations in particular is largely uncontested in its uniqueness and richness, and it forms the bedrock of so much modern scholarship on the period. The information it contains about different groups of people, professions, the imperial establishment, it allows historians to reconstruct the social fabric of India at the turn of the 17th century in a way that would be simply impossible using only the earlier sources. It truly is a benchmark for studying India at that time. And its enduring importance is reflected in the fact that it's been translated into English multiple times by scholars trying to unlock its wealth of information over the centuries.
So we've really taken a deep dive today, starting right down in the soil of the village field, navigating up through the layers of community, power, administration, following the threads of trade and production, and finally arriving at this incredible source, the Ain, that lets us see so much of this complex world.
That's right. We've explored the lives of the peasants, the Kashta, and the Kashta. We've looked at the complex structure of the village community with its intricate social layers, its caste-based inequities, but also its systems of governance through the Panchayats. We've uncovered the vital, often absolutely indispensable, roles played by women and artisans in this agrarian economy.
And we've looked beyond the fields into the distinct world of the forest dwellers, the Zhongli, their seasonal lives, and their complex interactions with the expanding state and economy. We've examined the powerful position and the diverse functions of those crucial intermediaries, the Zamindars. We've untangled the intricate administrative system the Mughal state built to assess and collect land revenue, its lifeblood. And we've seen how this entire structure was surprisingly linked to and fueled by a global flow of silver, creating an increasingly monetized economy. All illuminated, time and again, by the unique lens provided by sources like the extraordinary Ain-i Akbari.
And unpacking these sources, digging into them like this, it allows us, and hopefully you listening, to move beyond those simplistic narratives of empire, just kings and battles, and see a far richer, more nuanced picture of this pivotal period in Indian history.
Yeah.
It reveals this dynamic, incredibly complex society, full of intricate relationships between individuals, families, castes, communities, local elites like the Zamindars, and the overarching state, and full of economic connections that stretch not just across the subcontinent, but, as we saw with the silver, literally span the globe. It shows the resilience, the adaptations, the strategies of the people navigating this whole system of power and resources.
It really makes you consider the threads of continuity that might persist across centuries, the fundamental importance of land, the complexities of community dynamics, perhaps even forms of resistance that echo. And it also highlights the radical differences, too, the specific nature of state power back then, the forms of leverage available to different groups, like peasant mobility.
Absolutely. And perhaps it leaves us with a thought to ponder, something connecting that amazing source, the Ain, the power of the state, and the realities on the ground. Considering the immense detail collected in the Ain, detail intended primarily for imperial control, and considering that unprecedented inflow of global silver that enabled cash revenue collection on a new scale, what does this truly tell us about the actual power dynamics on the ground? Did the state's sophisticated system, its detailed records, translate into absolute control? Or was it always a constant, messy negotiation with local realities, particularly with those militarily powerful Zamindars and with those resilient peasant communities who held that ultimate card of simply abandoning their land if pushed too far? How did the global economy's demand for Indian goods, paid for in silver, ultimately shape the daily choices and lives of someone actually working the land in a Mughal village? Did it change what they chose to plant, or how they were paid for their labor in ways we can only glimpse?
Fascinating questions. Really thinking about the real impact of all those layers we've uncovered today. Thank you for taking this deep dive with us.
Always a pleasure. It's a rich topic.
Keep digging and stay curious about the layers of history beneath the surface narratives. We'll see you next time on The Deep Dive.